Well, good morning. It is really a pleasure for us to be here today and for our good friend Ross to be up at Woodland with our folks. It's a real treat to kind of be with you folks. Under the category of variety is the spice of life. If you like what you hear today, great. If you don't, Ross will be back next week. Okay? All right. And I particularly want to thank our musician and our choir for the anthem today. It was one I suggested many years ago. Back in Fredericton, there was a little small rural church whose favorite hymn was "Love Lifted Me." And we used to sing it all the time. And after a while I thought, Love Lifted Me, that's about the story of Peter walking on the water. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the distant shore. Love lifted me from the angry waves and all the rest of it. So whenever you hear that hymn, Love Lifted Me, think about this passage of Scripture which we had read for us today about Jesus and Peter and the disciples out in the boat and walking on the water. Now, when you hear this story of Peter and Jesus walking on the water, I'd like to suggest to you that for a lot of people, it's in that same category as Jonah and the whale, or Jonah and the large fish that swallowed Jonah and then spit him up on land. If you're a modern day person, and most of us are, from the 17th century, they say that's when modernity started, when the scientific revolution came in, and truth began to be equated with what you could see, touch, hear, taste, and smell, and repeat in an experiment. If you're a modern-day person and you hear this story, the first question that often comes into people's minds is, did it happen? Did it happen? Did Jesus and Peter actually walk on water? Because science sort of says, hey, not too much. It's kind of like being swallowed by a fish. Pinocchio did it, but not so sure about Jonah, But you know what? If you focus on just the question of, did it really happen, you're going to miss the point. Because prior to the 17th century, and more now as we are in post-modernity, people are realizing that truth is not just about what science can tell us. Truth is not just about facts. Truth can be there in all kinds of religious and spiritual stories that have something to tell us. A great biblical theologian once said, quoting a First Nations storyteller, he said, "I don't know whether this story actually happened exactly this way, but I know that this story is true." Truth doesn't depend on necessarily the factuality. So you can believe that Peter and Jesus actually walked on the water in this story, and that's fine, or you can maybe even question that. But I'm suggesting to you today there's a message in this story that's bigger and more important than whether it actually happened or not. Okay? And this is the message from my perspective. It's all about managing our fear. How many times in the Gospels do you hear Jesus saying, "Be not afraid"? Be not afraid. Don't be afraid. Fear not. Even in this passage it occurs 2 or 3 times. I bet you if you did a word count of just how many times Jesus says, "Be not afraid," you'd see lots and lots and lots of instances where Jesus says this. And one of the reasons he says this is because when fear drives our lives as individuals and as churches and as congregations and as people in society, if fear drives us, it destroys us. One of the examples that often comes to mind when I'm talking about this is in teaching. I was in Montreal at the college there for a while, and my colleague says, we can't be worried all the time about not teaching these students everything they're going to need to know in order to be good ministers. Because you know what? We're not going to be able to do it. In 4 years, you just can't teach ministers everything they need to know because learning is lifelong. And they're probably going to learn a lot more after they graduate and are ordained than during the time with us. So we can't let a fear drive our curriculum. And it's the same with church life. It's the same with church life. We can't let fear drive all of our decisions that we make as congregations and as churches. Because Jesus said, be not afraid. This is a great story, you know. Here we have, and it's full of symbolism in this story. I asked the person who was doing the PowerPoint for me today it's not there. There's no PowerPoint today in this service? No, not in this service. Oh, well, that's funny. I thought there would be. Anyway, if you go on the website of the United Church or even the World Council of Churches, you will see that a symbol and the image for the church in those is a boat. The bark, B-A-R-Q-U-E, the bark of St. Peter. Ancient symbol for what it is. And actually, down in Canso, where I was first a minister, the roof, the ceiling of the church actually looks like the hull of a boat. I don't know if you've ever been in a church like that, but it's a very, very common symbol for the church, is the boat. So think of the boat that these disciples were in out on the lake and on the sea as being the church. That's the first symbol. And then there is the wind and the waves, the water, if you will. Water for ancient Jews was a mixed blessing. They needed it to drink and to wash and to do all kinds of things. It was essential, especially in a dry, arid kind of area. But the Jews as a group were not a seafaring nation. They didn't like the ocean, the sea. It was kind of a scary place. I mean, in some of the Psalms it talks about the sea monster, Leviathan, that lives in the ocean. You know, who knows what lies underneath the surface there? It's kind of scary. We're going to stay away from that for the most part. And so you have these disciples in the boat, out on the lake, and some places say the sea, out on the sea, and the wind is blowing and the waves are tossing the boat here and there and everywhere, and they're terrified. They're terrified. And then, all of a sudden, in the midst of it, you get this ghostly form walking on the water towards them. You know? In their minds, ghosts were not on the positive side of the ledger in terms of spirits. There was no Casper the Friendly Ghost back then. You know? Ghosts were scary. If you saw a ghost, you were in trouble. And so, again, they were terrified. The wind, the waves, the water, the ghost. They had lots of things to be terrified. And their boat was being buffeted, if you will, by the waves all along. They were terrified. And in reality, the early church was like that. I mean, they were being persecuted for the first 4 centuries of the church's life. When they said the word church back then, they didn't think of a building right off the way we do, because there was no building. The church met in the catacombs, in people's kitchens, around, just in small groups here and there. You know, there was no building. And the reason for that is they were persecuted, because there were 3 charges against the early church. One was treason. They talked about a lord and an empire other than Caesar and Rome. You know, actually, when people were brought into the church on Easter Eve, the last thing they were taught was the Lord's Prayer, because it was so treasonous. Thy kingdom come. Thy kingdom come. Not Rome's, not Caesar's. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth, not Caesar's will. You know, it was treason. The second thing that the early Christians were accused of was cannibalism, because everybody heard them talking about eating the body and drinking the blood, communion, and they didn't understand it. And the third thing, believe it or not, that they were charged with was atheism, because they had a God you couldn't see. Everybody else had a God, you know, that was in the house or in the temple, but these folks were atheists. They don't have a God. You can't see it. Didn't understand it. They were persecuted as a group. And they had lots of reasons to fear. They had persecution, being thrown to the lions in the arena, having some Roman soldier come along to them, put a sword to their neck and says, "Swear allegiance to Caesar as Lord." And if they said, "Jesus is Lord," off went their head. They were persecuted. Lots of things to be afraid of. And yet Jesus, and starvation. The other thing the Romans did was siphon all of their goods and their lands and everything and make them roams. And so the average person, I think, lived on about 800 calories a day, the average Jew. Not very much. They didn't have to go to Weight Watchers back then. Lots of things to be afraid of. And in the midst of this, Peter, in this story, says, "Okay, Jesus, if that's Lord, if that's really you, tell me to come and walk to you on the water." And so Jesus says, "Come along. Come." And so Peter starts to walk on the water, and then all of a sudden, the waves kind of catch his attention and bat him around a little bit, and holy crow, what am I doing? And he sinks. And, "Lord, save me." And Jesus comes and helps him, lifts him out of the angry waves, as the song says. And they both get back into the boat, and all of a sudden, the waves and the wind die down, and it's okay. I'd like to suggest to you today that the church in our day and age does not have the fine, calm seas that it did 30 years ago. In 1966, the United Church of Canada had over 1 million members. We're about half that now. The decline has been regular, and if it continues at the current rate, about 2020, we'll all be gone. So we got to do something different. We have to do something different than what we're doing. And so, among other things, we're a little bit afraid of the future. And I know you folks are kind of a little bit anxious about what's going to happen after August. Whether Ross is going to be our new moderator, or he's going to be still here, or somewhere else, or whatever. The future is an unknown country, and it makes us all kind of nervous and afraid. And what are some of the other things that kind of bump up against the boat of the church these days? I mean, we have all these scandals that we hear about in the news. It's not fun being a Christian when you hear about the sex scandals in the news. And yet, I was reflecting on this the other day, and I thought, it hasn't stopped a lot of people putting their kids in minor hockey. Or our more conservative evangelical brothers and sisters in our own families and our neighbors who say, "You United Church folk, you don't know what you believe. You're not really Christian." The time has come, folks, for us not to be afraid, to focus on what we do, on what we believe in, and what we are proud of as the United Church, and not live in fear anymore. That's how we're going to turn the ship of the church around to go in the other direction. So, I would like to suggest to you a metaphorical meaning in this passage today, and it's this. Keep your eyes on Jesus when you're walking on the water. How many of you remember the old TV show Kung Fu with David Carradine? Yeah, a few of you? There was a great episode in that in the temple when he was learning how to balance, and the priest there said, "Okay, here is a beam, and I want you to walk along it without falling off. Oh, and by the way, there's boiling oil all around you. So keep your eye on the beam and you'll be all right." So he got walking along, and all of a sudden he, out of the corner of his eye, spotted a skeleton in the water. Poof! Fell into what turned out to be warm water. And the skeleton wasn't really real. It was just a sheet of paper with the skeleton printed on it. The message, of course, of the priest was, if you would have been all right, if you'd kept your eye on the beam. Same way with Peter walking on the water. If he'd kept his eyes on Jesus, he would have been all right, instead of getting distracted in fear by the waves and the wind. There's lots that can distract us in churches, and I'm sure you must have your windy people and your wavy people here in this congregation as well, much as anything else. But the main plank, the main focus on Jesus is still here. As a church, you have a ministry and a mission in this community of healing, of caring for the poor, of speaking the truth to power, and all of those things are helping this world that God so loves. You are being faithful disciples of Jesus Christ, and you have your eyes on Jesus, and that's good news, and that can take you through the stormy weather. The other thing in that passage is you're going to be okay if you keep Jesus in your boat. If Jesus is in your boat, the waves won't get you. No? That's my message for you today from this story. There's a lot more there in that story than just whether it happened or not. Be not afraid, as Jesus says. Be not afraid of now, of what's happening now, what's going to happen in the future. Keep your eyes on Jesus and have Jesus in your church, in your boat, and you'll be fine. Amen.